Welcome to the 2024 K-State Garden Hour webinar series. We are so glad you're here. This webinar series started in 2020 and has been a collaboration of the entire K-State Horticulture Extension team. Since the start of the program, we have reached over 50,000 gardeners just like you. We are pleased to continue offering the K-State Garden Hour series for free. If you have enjoyed these educational webinars, please consider making a tax-deductible donation to support this program. The link to donate can be found in the chat or on our K-State Garden Hour website. This webinar is hosted by Kansas State Research and Extension. My name is Lane Weens, and I'm the Horticulture Extension Agent for Shawnee County. Everyone involved in the development of this series is an extension professional for K-State. Most of us have a background in horticultural education or related discipline, but most of all, we each have a love for educating and sharing important gardening topics. Before we get started today, we do have a few housekeeping notes to cover. Please use the Q&A feature for questions related to the presentation. This is where we will be looking for questions at the end of the webinar during the Q&A session. You should see a button along the bottom tab that says Q&A. Just click on that and you'll be able to enter your question. Today's webinar will be recorded. We will post it to our K-State Garden Hour website. We typically upload additional resources related to the topic as well. If we share links through the chat, we will also link them on the website. Our website is where you will have access to previous topics and upcoming topics in the 2024 series. Our moderators today are Laura Phillips and Sharon Ashworth, and they will be sharing information through the chat during the presentation. They will also help us facilitate the Q&A portion of the webinar. Today's topic is gardening with the changing climate. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Chuck Rice, University Distinguished Professor in the Department of Agronomy. Please give us a few moments while we transition and share the presentation slides.
Okay. You should be able to see the presentation now. Lane?
Looks great. Looks good, Dr. Rice.
Okay, all right. All right, well, thanks everyone. This next 45 minutes or so, we'll talk about how one of the next greatest challenges facing us is trying to garden in a changing climate. So I'm gonna spend the first half talking about what climate change patterns are projected to happen. And then the second half, figure out how, make some suggestions on how we will potentially adapt to that changing, those changes. So first of all, we have to understand a little bit about climate change, what it is and what it is not. Let's see, sorry. So what you see here is the global land and ocean temperature for the last 150, 170 years or so. And what you should see here is that based on a 30-year average, that the late 19th century, late 1800s, were cooler than the average 30-year average. But what you should also see is on the right side of this graph is these are documented global temperatures that since about 1970s or so, there's been a considerable increase in our global temperatures. And there's some variability there that we're talking about climate and not weather. The difference between climate is that we're looking at longer term patterns. Weather is what happens day to day or week to week. Climate is more on a decades or 10-year time scales. But what you see here is there's been a consistent trend for increasing temperatures. So that right now we're in a period of hottest temperatures about 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit. increase, almost getting close to 2 degrees at a global level. And actually, that's been higher than over the last 1,000 years. That's going back to records and measurements for temperature. So that's what's happened. But what we're thinking about in the future is what are those projections for climate that will happen in this case by the end of this current century. And so what you see here is 2 projections. The one on the left is the low pathway, which means if we, as a global community, try to do something about reducing the temperature increases, which are primarily caused by carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane. These are called greenhouse gases. And this is if we collectively try to reduce those emissions. On the right, which is really what the pathway we're on, unfortunately, we're on right now, is what's expected by the end of the century based on projections, not predictions, projections. And what you should see here, it's not uniform. The higher latitudes, particularly in the northern hemisphere, are projected to get 13 to over 15 degrees Fahrenheit higher. Here in North America, that ranges about 10 degrees. There's some variation. What you should see here, also, there are areas on the planet that are where minimal change or slight cooling, so the planet is not warming uniformly. But there's another aspect with the climate, the changing climate, is it's not just temperature, it's also precipitation. And this is the one for my area research and what I think about causes more heartburn is how to figure out to do with the changing precipitation. I'll talk a little bit more about this. But what you see again is the pathways, the high emission pathway, which is the current pathway that we're on right now. The projections are that the wet areas will get wetter and the dry areas will get drier. And you can see most of us are online that I saw were from Kansas, but that there'll be slight decreases to significant decreases in precipitation. And for those in western Kansas, they're on the edge of a significant increase or decreases in precipitation, and which should be disconcerting because also with a declining Ogallala aquifer, it's a double whammy and since less precipitation and declining water resources out in western Kansas. But anyway, and so you can see here that a large swath, particularly from at least agriculture production, is going to be hampered by decreases in precipitation. But that's only part of the story. We'll dig deeper into that. Precipitation intensity, which I'll talk a little bit more about, but we're expected to see higher extreme, more higher intense rainstorm events. And that's illustrated here. But even though that water is coming down in more intense rainstorm events, we may get this, because of warmer temperatures, there's going to be greater evaporation. So as a result, what you see in the bottom panel here is an increase in the number of dry days. And even though there's higher precipitation because of higher evaporation, we're going to see greater droughts or dryness, which affects growing plants and gardening. Again, to go back and look at historical changes, so you can see how things have changed or are changing. This is going back to 1901, and what you see here is the change in temperature for the contiguous U.S. Going from 1901 to 2020 on a decadal scale. And clearly you can see that, I think you should be able to see that we are warming up to a degree or so higher in the United States over that 120-year period. But the other thing that's pointed out here, and I know there's some other people outside of Kansas online, that it's not uniform across the United States. In fact, the Southeast has less warming. In fact, a little bit cooling up until just recently. But you can see here that the Southeast, and we're not sure why that is, the weather or the climate patterns, but again, it's not uniform. But for the most part of the United States, um, that we are significantly warming, particularly in the western half of the United States, and that would be from Kansas on west, and particularly the south part of the U.S. The same is true for precipitation changes over the 120 years. Again, there's significant patterns across the U.S. I said the dry air is going to get drier, and what we have seen is that the Southwest, it changes from decade to decade, but is drier, about on the order of 10% drier. The middle part of the country, and particularly the upper Midwest, the last 20 years, well, actually the last 30 years, have been wetter. Particularly if we look at seasonal changes, the spring is wetter in Iowa, Minnesota, northeast Kansas, but then the summer and fall tend to be drier. I don't have it broken down by season. And so that distribution is going to change. I know the last month or so we've had a significant amount of snow. Again, that's weather patterns, but the long-term trends are we're going to see less snow in the central part in Kansas, here in the central part of the United States. And that's changing from less snow to more rain as we warm up the wintertime temperatures. Another characteristic of the changing climate, I mentioned about precipitation, and this is the one that is, I guess, a cause, makes it harder for me or for agriculture or gardening specifically to deal with, and even urban areas outside of flooding and that. And this is what you see is the change in heavy precipitation events. And what we're seeing is that there's a increase in the change in 20-year return precipitation events. So that means that we're going to get more intense rainstorm events, and then drier periods in between, particularly if there's not much change in precipitation. That has major implications because not only affects gardening, affects agriculture. You have more intense rainstorm events, more soil erosion, but then there's more flooding downstream that then affects urban areas, and flood infrastructures are not adequate to handle the water that's coming down the Kansas River down to Lawrence, Topeka, or Kansas City. So we're going to flood infrastructure containing is not adequate to meet the changing climate. That's kind of a side note here, but should be concerning not only for rural areas but urban areas as well. And this is another way to show it is the the 2-day precipitation event, you can see the trends here that since the 1900s through 2020 is that we're seeing a relative number increase in heavy precipitation events, and that trend is certainly started in the 1970s, 80s, up to a significant increase in the last 2 or 3 decades. And another way to look at across the United States, it varies. As I showed earlier, the precipitation is less in the Southwest. So we're actually seeing decreasing um, uh, flood magnitude in the western half, for the most part, western half of the United States, and an increase. The size of the triangle indicates the percent rate of change per decade. So we're seeing more frequent flooding events in the central Great Plains, Midwest, and also in the Northeast. It'll be interesting to see. I know that what's on the news the last week is the atmospheric river that has occurred in California, LA. I guess it does show an increase in flood events, but we're going to see more of these intense rainstorm events. And I'll give a local example here in 2018. This is Manhattan, Kansas. If for those that are familiar with Manhattan, this used to be a grocery store. I think it was Ray's Market here. There's a bar and grill here on the west side of campus, west side of town. So 2018 was really unusual. We were in a drought. We were 30% below normal up until Labor Day. And then 4 hours later, we were normal or slightly above normal. We had about 8 to 10 inches rain precipitation in that 4-hour event. And so we're not equipped to handle that. I don't think there's many places that can handle 8 to 10 inches in 4 hours. So what we're seeing is that causes major soil erosion, causes economic damage, and makes it more challenging for growing plants, growing or gardening in those things. So not only do we have to think about these flood events, but then we also have to think about how to handle the dry periods in between. So the extreme events and seasonality is absolutely critical and challenging for growing plants. Again, looking at some of the seasonal changes, these are projections. Annual temperatures are expected in the central part of the northern plains, increased by 5 to 6 degrees. But what's really important is the seasonality. We're going to see warmer winters and significantly warmer winters and slightly warmer summers. The other thing that doesn't show on here is that nighttime temperatures are showing a significant increase. Why is that important? Well, there's 2 things going on here. Warmer winters, we need, a lot of times winters are important for killing pests and diseases. So we're going to have more pests and disease survive over that winter, and that's going to be a greater challenge for growing plants. And then the nighttime temperatures, that stresses the plants. Nighttime temperatures is when the plants recover. And so warmer nights are detrimental for plant growth. And so that's going to be, is a challenge now and going to be causing future challenges as well. Let's see. Yeah, let's see. Okay. The same thing with precipitation. This shows the seasonal. I talked a little bit about this, but in the northern Great Plains, We're seeing a slight increase in precipitation, but again, the seasonality is really important. Here in the central part of the US, Kansas, wintertime precipitation is actually I think there's some people online from Nebraska. We're going to see heavier precipitation. So we might actually see more snowfall depending upon those changes in temperature. I mentioned the upper half, the upper Midwest, upper Great Plains are going to see about a 15% increase in precipitation. That affects our planting dates, more so for agriculture. But again, if the soils are too wet, we can't get in, prepare the beds and get those plants in the ground or seeds in the ground. The other thing, if it's wetter soils, that may increase pests and diseases, such as root rot and other diseases. But then we get those wet cycles in the spring, and then it immediately switches to dry periods, drought. And so we're going to actually see a change that the summer is going to be drier. And so again, how those plants adjust, or how do we manage those plants and gardens to adapt to that seasonal change? Wetter springs, drier summers, fall's kind of in between. And so that makes it something to think about and manage for. And then the other thing is, even though we may have those extreme events, greater precipitation in some areas, northeast Kansas, kind of like Iowa, is getting wetter, or projected to get wetter, where western Kansas is projected to get drier. Probably 1 or 2 inches less rainfall. But when it comes in those events, we got warmer atmosphere, and so that's going to increase evaporation. So even though the precipitation, kind of the middle part of the state, may or may not change much, but with the warmer temperatures, we're going to see increased evaporation. And so that's going to dry out those soils. And that's why you saw in that one graph, we have increased precipitation, but even drier soils because of that evaporation. And again, I'll suggest some things that how do we adapt to that from a gardening perspective. So we got this change in temperature and precipitation. I showed those patterns, but this is the one that I think is the most challenging, that keeps me thinking awake at night, is how to handle these extremes. If we go from an 8-inch rainstorm event to a drought, flash droughts, we might have, and we have had recently, I think last week it was 70 degrees in parts of Kansas. It can be 80 degrees in April, and then we have a freeze or frost event. And so trees are starting to bud out, fruit trees, flower, and then we get hit with a killing, or a frost that damages those flowers and affects productivity of fruit trees, grapes, and other perennial fruits. And so again, that it's something that's harder to control, these extreme events, and harder to adapt to. And again, Kansas, well, the last two, bottom two, again, the dust storms, we've seen a lot of dust storms, not so much this year, but last year. Winters draw on dust storms in early spring, late winter, and wildfires, particularly in central and southwest Kansas on our grasslands. And that smoke then affects air quality. Okay, so the impacts, the summary is, and when I do a webinar like this, it's always, okay, this is the first half is um, bad news, I guess. But we got to deal with water. both too much and too little in the same season. How do we handle heat? Um, and I'll talk. Yeah, and so this last year was a unfortunately, at least in parts of Kansas, was an example where we had August was high temperatures above 100, 110 degrees Fahrenheit in mid-August, and a lot of plants were uh, suffered from that. But then Labor Day weekend, that we had another week of 100-degree plus temperatures, and that hammered a lot of plants. And in my own garden, that I lost some even perennials that we'll talk about that I'll suggest is some adaptation, but they got hurt. I lost uh, 4 or 5 pine trees that I planted about 4 or 5 years ago, and I didn't get the water on them. I was trying to limit my water use, and I waited too long, and I lost those trees. So again, we can do some adaptation measures, but then getting those multiple heat events can affect the survivability of those plants. And then the last part is we're going to have more extremes. We're already seeing that now, more variability. We go from intense rainstorm events to drought. We get cold snaps, warm springs, and then a late frost. That's going to affect plant growth and budding of trees. Uh, Now that I guess you could argue this is showing growing season. And so the opening of first leaf has uh, the is earlier now by about 4 to 8 days in Kansas, and particularly for the northern half of the United States, we're seeing warmer springs, and so actually the growing season has increased somewhere around 10 to 14 days already. We've documented across the state the 100-year records for across the state, and it's pretty consistent that on the order of 7 to 14 days longer growing season. Now, a lot of people would consider that great, but you got to remember a long growing season, then you're going to need more water and more nutrients to take advantage of that growing season. So it may not be necessarily a great thing. The USDA has produced plant hardiness zone maps. And what I've shown here, this was controversial when it came out. This is 1990 map showing the different zones. And for Kansas, what we're in zone 6 and 5 and 6. That has shifted so that now the warmer temperatures that most of Kansas is in zone 6, I guess all of Kansas in zone 6, and even a little bit of zone 7 in that. And so everything's basically shifted north as we see that continental US change in warmer temperatures. So now we have to think about different hardiness zones, different plant species or cultivars to handle those different temperatures. So just to give you a little bit, the temperature, oh, sorry, this is in centigrade, sorry. The 22 would be about 75 degrees Fahrenheit. 35 would be in the 90s Fahrenheit. So a lot of our vegetable crops um, have a tolerance range for vegetative growth ranging from, for broccoli cool season crops, we're talking about 40 degrees Fahrenheit up to a little in the mid 70s, upper 70s. But then tomatoes, you can see here, watermelons are a little more tolerant. That's vegetative growth. Unfortunately, reproductive growth, when those flowers, they're often less tolerant to heat. And so you can see here, for the most part, we're talking 25 degrees centigrade, which is in the mid to upper 70s, if I did my calculation correct. And so they're going to be, so when we have those 90-degree temperatures, um, they're going to have less fruit, less production for those crops. Um, so that's on the vegetable side. Fruits and nuts. What we're concerned about is that um, warmer temperatures are going to cause earlier bud break and flowering in the spring. That's an increased faster development. That is not necessarily a good thing. Faster development for plants, whether it's wheat or vegetables or fruits, is they grow. The faster development means that you end up with smaller, um, less yield, more smaller fruit and vegetables because they grow too fast. And then the other problem is then if they have bud break, then we get a cold snap, then that's going to affect the production of those fruits. And it says no peach crop this year. That was actually last year, 23. They had Georgia, which is the peach state. They had a warm spring and then a cold snap and then wiped out basically the peach crop for the state of Georgia. And I know there's some people online from Tennessee, so they might have been impacted the same way. But the other thing is I briefly mentioned is that we're going to see with those warmer winters, warmer nights, we're going to see more pests that generally and diseases that generally resided in Texas, Florida, Georgia are now moving, um, uh, migrating up to the central part of the United States. So we're going to have new diseases that we in Kansas or in or other parts of the U.S. that we haven't experienced before. And also with warmer temperatures, you're going to have multiple pest cycles. You're going to have increased generations per year. Instead of having one or two generations of those insects, you might have two or three. And so that means multiple hits on those growing plants. Okay, so for the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about solutions. It's interesting. I work in agriculture, row crop agriculture, and native prairies, but a lot of the things that I discuss for our large fields, corn, wheat, soybean, cotton, really translate to gardens. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about those. So the solutions, I'll explain these in detail, but really soil health, I'm a soil scientist, I'm biased, but really I think soil health is really key, that it provides some of the buffer, the resiliency against those extreme events, both water and heat. Less disturbance in agriculture, row crop agriculture, we talk about no-till, but we can also do less tillage of the gardens, and we don't necessarily need to till, and there's reasons for that. The use of cover crops during the winter, keeping that soil covered, that adds biomass, improves the soil health, recycles nutrients. Mulch is absolutely critical, composting, but also in planting the garden, thinking of plant diversity. So you don't have that you have multiple um, crops, plants there to buffer the diseases, the pests, and create some diversity in that way. Native plants are a little bit more acclimated to the climate that we have in Kansas, and then look at annual plants that have been bred, cultivated, that are more adaptive to the changing climate, whether it's water restrictions or temperature heat tolerance. Okay, a little bit about soil health. This is my favorite topic. This is what I call the holy trinity of soil health. And we're talking about soil organic carbon or organic matter as a key component for healthy soils, and that creates healthy plants. But the trinity part is there's a connection between organic matter, microbial activity, the biological activity of soil, and soil structure. And so those three are interrelated. They support each other. And if you have those three things, then you're going to have better soil structure. It's going to have more porosity. It's going to capture those intense rainstorm events, maybe not the 8 or 10 inches, but the 3 or 4 inches. And that water is going to be retained in the soil and provide a buffer for those dry periods in between those heavy events, heavy rainstorm events. With organic matter, you're going to have other nutrients besides carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus that really support the plant growth. And so they're all interrelated and support a more healthy garden. So again, I talked about less tillage. This is a row crop agriculture example, but by not tilling the soil, you're retaining that organic matter, that carbon. The residue on the surface, when we get to mulch and compost, it's going to prevent or minimize evaporation. So you're going to conserve that water, particularly during those dry events. And there's other reasons, again, for reduce erosion. Again, for gardening, it's going to improve your general soil fertility. You're going to be able to get into the garden faster after rainstorm events. And there's some other benefits for row crop agriculture, but it applies to gardening as well. And this really shows the biological activity and how it affects soil structure. And what you see here is, disregard the left panel, but these are fungal hyphae in the soil. And what you see here is that by less tillage, more carbon in the soil, that hyphae will trap those soil particles and glue them together. And that's really, really important because now those particles are more resistant to erosion and allows the water to infiltrate into the soil. And what's illustrated below here is a soil that's been tilled, doesn't have the aggregate structure, those soil particle structure. And hopefully you can easily see that soil, when it wets up, we add water to it, it's not glued together and it dissolves. Well, if it's on the soil surface, where does it go? It's going to go off your garden downstream, and you're going to lose all those nutrients that are in the topsoil. In a well-structured soil, this was either from a no-till or a native prairie, you can see that you add water to it and it retains its structure. Those hyphae, the biological activity, glue those particles together and make it more resilient. And this is, again, an illustration that comparing the green as native prairie infiltration, you can see it's going to capture those rainstorm events. The blue across the state, this is Tribune Haze and here in Manhattan. These are ag fields, but the same would be true for gardening, is that the blue would be less tillage, maybe adding some cover crops, create roots to feed the microbes, create that soil structure. And you can see that water infiltration is or aggregates are enhanced in those cases. So we got better structure for that. So it really becomes important to think about that soil health, organic matter is the key. So how do we do that? I mentioned not tilling soil. The till will break up those soil particles and expose the organic matter, destroy the soil structure. But adding plant material or organic material to the soil, to the garden, is one way to do that. And we have some long-term research showing the benefits of adding compost. But if I'm adding compost, whether it's food waste, adding manure, again, adding mulch to that soil surface, you can improve the soil structure. And we don't have to till that material in. I got in my own garden flower beds, I have mulch on the surface that suppresses weeds, so I don't have to go out and weed as much, but I'm improving my soil. And it also retains that moisture. I'm preventing that layer of compost or mulch on the surface is reducing evaporation. So now I'm retaining, making more effective use of that precipitation or irrigation. The other benefits of mulch is that it cools the soil, so that bare soil surface heats up. That affects microbial activity, but also hampers the roots. And I mentioned about suppressing the weeds. Composting is another way. Again, putting the compost on the surface. You don't have to till it in. Use that organic layer to create the benefits of water savings. Plant selection. I'm sure the horticulture extension specialist can give better advice, but looking at one way to make more effective use of the water, more heat tolerance is perennials. Perennials have developed a deep root system. I'm showing the native prairie, the roots there, that diversity of roots going down deep. Not only is it capturing water and extracting water from deeper in the soil during those dry periods, but it's also recycling nutrients, pulling nutrients that have moved down the soil deep in the profile and moving up near the soil surface. So whether it's cultivated annual plants that might have deep root systems, but particularly native plants have evolved with those root systems. Looking at annuals, I mentioned this earlier, we need to select cultivars that are more heat tolerant, drought tolerant. And I know there's varieties and cultivars out there at the garden store that thinking about the ability to handle those extreme events as much as possible. Plant diversity and rotation. Again, for pest control, this is important. Having multiple plants in there so it doesn't it harbors beneficial plants, pollinators, but also insects that will feed on some of the negative pests that affect plant growth. And so having that diversity is really important to support the beneficial plants as well. Legumes, these are great for, you could do intercropping in between tomatoes or your vegetable crops, but putting in clovers in there, again, that's adding mulch. But the nice thing about legumes is that they fix nitrogen from the air and add it to the soil. And so that means less fertilizer, that external fertilizer that you have to apply. That's less energy. So using legumes as a cover crop, interseeding a legume in between some of the non-legume vegetable crops. Of course, from a human nutrition standpoint, legumes, your beans, are really important for protein and human nutrition as well. Watering, again, native plants aren't going to use less water, although, like I said, I should have watered earlier this last summer, because I did lose some native plants when that double whammy of 110 degrees weakened those plants in August. And then when we had that another week in September, it wiped a few of those out. So again, but you wouldn't have to use as much water, limiting the water, recycling water, catch the rainwater, um, uh, and use it in your garden. If you're going to do irrigation, don't water the atmosphere. It's better to use drip irrigation um, to uh, get it onto the soil surface, into the soil, rather than atmosphere. Sprinkler irrigation depends on the sprinkler, but a lot of it's going to be evaporated, so it's less efficient. So, in summary, some climate smart gardening ideas here, just a summary. Minimal disturbance, no, not tilling the soil. You don't need a rototill. Or and then adding mulch to the soil surface for water and temperature. Composting, same thing. It's conserved water, but you're adding nutrients as well. Maybe adding cover crops that helps add mulch then during the summer when winter kills. Think about plant diversity, using adaptive plants, particularly perennials, and then smart watering, drip irrigation, micro irrigation, and water reuse are some of the things. So with that, I think I will finish and hopefully take questions. And I didn't see the Q&A, so we'll see what we have.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Rice. We do have a number of questions and they are still coming in. So I'll start back up at the top. There were some questions that had to do with one of your first slides with your data with the temperature. So if you go back to that, there were some questions about how that data came to be. So for instance, a question here says it looked like roughly the last 10 years, there was no further rise. And
yeah, let me go. Sorry.
And while you're going back, there's a question about where that data came from, like where the temperatures are taken. Are they taken in cities? And I'll stop there until you can get.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I'm not which one you're referring to, but this graph shows the global land and ocean temperatures. So it's really a whole network of monitoring stations across the globe. Thousands of stations from that. They are screened for extremes, like if they happen to be, over time, maybe there was urban development, an airport put in, or concrete. So they remove those outliers to try to avoid changes in heat load, if they're concrete, blacktops and things like that. So they are averages. They use a rolling 30-year average. And so it's this data here on this slide. I forgot, I should have put that in there, but I believe that would have been, it was I think 1980 to 2010 is the rolling. They go in 30-year segments. So it'd be based on that. That's why you see the cooler temperatures in the previous century, because our temperatures are increasing. So if you look at current or more recent, that 1800s and early 1900s are actually cooler. I don't know if the person was asking about the last, but there's a lot of variability here. Actually, I think 2023 globally was the hottest on record. So there is some variability, and part of the I guess climate skeptics would say, okay, they looked at, say, here 1990, and then it was a decrease here, and they say, well, it's not really, there's a lot of variability, but you got to remember the climate is a long-term trend, and so there, yes, you'll have years that'll be cooler or warmer, but it's the long-term trend, and there's a consistent trend. The projections are well, it may look like it's leveling off, but the projections are that it's going to continue to increase, and we are hotter than in the last. I had a graph on that, but last 5,000 years.
Thank you. Is there any way, do you have any data or knowledge about how these temperature changes correspond to across the world in terms of differentiating between population and maybe more polluting countries? Are there?
Yeah, so yeah, that's a good question. So the driver, the cause of the increase in temperature is more what they call these greenhouse gases. So carbon dioxide, methane and nitrous oxide, and then also refrigerant, FS6 or hexafluoro something, SF6. So, but when it doesn't, the planet is agnostic, right? So when CO2 is emitted, it circulates around the world. So even though if it's coming from China or United States, it circulates around the world. So it evens out. So it's not local. It is a global average and an effect. That's why it's important to get the global community to act, and that's going to be the challenge, right? And try to do something about it. But yeah, so so it averages out across the globe.
And another question along these lines is someone is asking how are the extreme events that we're seeing lately linked to the global temperature increase of 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit? Are
Yeah.
there models showing explicit cause-effect relationships?
Yeah, and I obviously didn't have time for the details in that, and I teach a whole course on it. So the reason is that with warmer temperatures, that you're going to get more evaporation. So you get more water vapor in the atmosphere as a result of the temperature increase. So it holds more water. But then, we have circulation patterns. So that cooler air, I shouldn't say cold, the cooler air, then meets that warm air, and then we have these flash events. And so that's why we're having these more extreme rainfall events, is that there's more water in the atmosphere and then it dumps. And so it is a result of the extreme rainfall events is the result of the warming atmosphere. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. A couple of questions. I feel that there's a lot of questions that are still coming in, so I'm still going down the list here. So I'll try to combine some of these. We had a number of people who were concerned about the impacts of the climate change you're describing on native plants and also our native pollinators.
Yeah. Yeah, so part of my work is on the tallgrass prairie in Kansas. Well, actually, the prairies across Kansas. So what we're seeing is, well, it's a mixed effect, but because of the change in seasonality, we're seeing more invasive species on the prairie. Part of it's human, well, I guess it's all human cause, but part of it's management of the prairies, but also cedars and Caucasian bluestem are better adapted to those extreme events and the change weather patterns, and so we're seeing more invasive species across the prairies. The tallgrass prairie is pretty resilient. The prairies are, because they've evolved over time to handle those extremes. But the question is, is it getting when will it hit or be too much? The 2012-14 drought in western Kansas really, in many cases, saw a decrease in the species composition and the productivity of the mixed shortgrass prairie in western Kansas. So one of the solutions that K-State was recommending was to, and NRCS as well, was to remove cattle, let that prairie heal for 2 or 3 years because it had been damaged, and actually pulling the cattle off earlier so you didn't do extensive damage, permanent damage.
Great, thank you. And now moving to some vegetable gardening questions. A good question is, what do you recommend for planting fruits and vegetables to adapt to this climate change?
Yeah, well, I'm a soil scientist, so I probably would want to turn that over to the horticulture specialist as well. I mean, I guess in my own gardening there, I mean, there's tomato cultivars that are a little more heat tolerant, drought tolerant. Yeah, maybe the horticulture specialist can add and contribute to that.
Okay, let's see. Looking for, here's one. In the projections, you mentioned the low pathway and the high pathway on a larger scale. Oh, somebody's such as the university, or on a larger scale, such as the university or companies. What can we do to move more towards the lower pathway?
Yeah, that's the challenge, right? So there's several ways to reduce those greenhouse gas emissions. CO2, about 60 to 70% is coming from fossil fuels. So looking at renewables, energy conservation are ways to reduce those CO2 emissions. Nitrous oxide is mostly coming from nitrogen fertilizer in agricultural row crop systems, grain systems. So doing better nitrogen management in that case. Methane is a little bit more diverse. We got gas pipelines, landfills that produce methane. That's about 50% of the problem. And then the other 50% is from animal agriculture. We are working on ways here at K-State and other places to try to reduce those emissions from cattle, better feed quality, other ways to reduce those methane emissions. But it's going to take a collective effort. But energy conservation, looking at other alternative fuels are ways to do that. And there's actually, if you can reduce your energy use, conserve your energy use, that means paying less on your bills, right? So it's not just environmentally, it's also economically makes sense.
I see that there's a clarification requested about how does a rolling average differ from a simple 30-year average?
Say that again.
How does a rolling average differ from a simple 30-year average? There's a question about calculating
Yeah,
that.
so I don't know why the climate scientists, I'm not a climate scientist, but I work on the impacts. So the 30-year rolling average would take into account then if it's a rolling 30-year average, right? So if our temperature is warming, that average is going up, and then it's then what you're seeing is the individual years on top of that average. If you used, I mean, you can pick and choose. We could have picked. I'm sorry, I'm pointing to my screen. We could have picked 1880 to 1910. Well, then everything would be raised. But the climate whether people use the 30-year rolling average, I guess, to accommodate more adaptive, make adaptations, so we know accommodate that that increasing temperature.
Okay, thank you. A lot of questions that are in here are about things like mulches and recommendations for mulches and improving soil. So hopefully everyone out there will talk to their local extension agent to get some detailed information, particularly on crops that you might recommend, gardening crops, veggies and fruits you might recommend, different mulches to recommend, ways to improve your soil. So please contact your local extension agent to get some of those questions answered. So we're at the top of the hour now. So I'm going to turn it back over to our host to close out the session. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Sharon, and especially to Dr. Rice. We typically have more questions than we have time for, but we will be sure to link to several articles related to this session on our website. We hope these resources will help you to answer your questions, but if you need additional information, again, like Sharon said, contact your local K-State Extension office. Once again, thank you for joining our K-State Garden Hour series hosted by K-State Research and Extension. We're excited to continue offering this webinar series into 2024. Be watching your email for more details coming soon. You can visit the K-State Garden Hour website to view our recorded Garden Hour archive or to make a tax-deductible donation to support the continuation of this webinar series. This session was recorded and will be posted on the website by tomorrow afternoon. After this webinar ends today, you will receive a prompt to take an evaluation survey. Please fill this out. We would greatly appreciate your feedback. If you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at gardenhour@ksu.edu. Thank you again. We hope you continue to tune in on the first Wednesday of each month. Have a great week.